Hello my friends, and welcome to the fourth and final part of our Surreal Composite photography series. So in this segment, we're going to be talking about the editing process for the image that we have been working on. Now, if you haven't seen the previous videos, I recommend that you go back and watch them so that you'll understand what we're doing here and be able to follow along. There are links to those in the description below. So we already have our images gathered. We have our background and our subjects, which we shot in the last video. So let's go ahead and grab our first subject. So we talked about how we were shooting this in our previous video, and we chose to shoot with a nice soft, even lighting in order to match our background. And we also chose to shoot on a black background so that we could create a nice contrast between our subject and the background and make it easier for us to select that subject when we bring it into Photoshop. So how I'm going to begin is by using select subject, but if you're using an older version of Photoshop, you may not have this option. If that's the case, you can use the quick selection tool. So you can get to that by hitting W. You can also find it over here in your tools menu. Just grab quick selection tool, and you would then just drag this around your subject using it to select as you go. And Photoshop actually does a pretty good job with this tool, so you can definitely do this way. But what we're going to do today is go to select subject, and Photoshop is going to do the work for us. So it just makes our job that much easier. And now we need to refine our selection. So we're going to go to select and mask. And then we're going to zoom in here. So you can see that it missed a little bit of my eye here. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I just have the regular brush selected. So that's the third one here. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit more here. And I'm just going to add this eyebrow and eye in here, and you'll see that we are missing the eyelashes, and that's okay because we're going to fix that a little bit later on. So for right now, just don't worry about the eyelashes because the eyelashes are dark and they're on this black background. Photoshop is really just going to struggle to select those, so we're just going to paint those in later on. So the first thing that we're going to do here is we're going to grab our refine edge brush, which is this one right here, and we're going to just run this along the entire edge of our subject in order to make that selection a little more precise. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that right now. So now we're going to do the same thing around the hair. So the idea here is that we want to pick up these little flyaway hairs in order to make our hair selection look natural. We don't want it to look like we have kind of like a hair helmet here. If we want it to look like this subject is really on the background that we're going to bring it into, we need to keep those little flyaway hairs in our selection. So I'm just going to run this brush along here, trying to grab those flyaways as I go. Okay, so I think this is looking really good now. So we are ready to commit to this, so we'll just hit OK. And then we will make this into a layer mask. So we're going to hit this Add Layer Mask button. And now we have our selection. So we're going to add a solid color fill layer. And I'm just going to choose a bluish color because I know there's a lot of blue in the background that I'm going to be putting this on. And I'm just going to drag that beneath my subject layer. And we're going to do some further refinements on our selection. So I'm going to zoom in here. I'm actually going to zoom in pretty close. And first we'll start by doing a little refining on the hair. So we're going to make sure that we have our layer mask selected so that we can paint on our layer mask. We're going to get our brush tool and we're going to change the blending mode to overlay. And what this does is it just makes it so that, here, I'm gonna hold Option and click on the mask so you can see the mask for a moment here. It makes it so that we don't paint over areas that we don't want to, so we don't have to worry about like going outside the lines essentially. So for example, I have my brush set to black right now, but if I paint over this solid white area, it's not gonna do anything, because it's basically only going to paint over areas where there's already some black present. And that's how this kind of helps us to refine this without accidentally completely messing up our mask. So for example, you can see there's a tiny bit of the forehead that didn't get picked up here. So if I hit X to get white on my brush and I paint there, that'll pick that up. But it also won't pick up the black from the background. So I'm actually going to change the flow on my brush to somewhere around 30%. So that's close enough. And then I'm going to hold Option and click on my mask so that I can actually see what the image looks like, but I'm going to keep painting on the mask here. And the idea here is that I'm going to go X to get my black brush again. And I just kind of want to tap out some of this haziness that's getting picked up in the hair there. So I'm going to kind of just go back and forth between the black and the white because I still want those flyaway hairs to be in there, but I want to get rid of a little bit of that kind of haziness that's getting picked up from the background. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. I'm going to change my brush back to normal, and then I'm going to paint in black just to remove any parts that I know I just totally don't want. And I'll want to set my flow to 100 for this, so you can use the slider up here, or you can also hold Shift and hit 0 on your keyboard to set it to 100. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Now let's do our final little refinement here. So I want these eyelashes back, right? So what I'm gonna do for that is I'm gonna get my white brush and I'm gonna make my brush really small, like around 3 pixels, and I'll probably make it even smaller for a few strokes here. And we're just going to paint back in these eyelashes that should be here. Okay, and I think that already looks just fine. So we have our eyelashes. Let's see, maybe we should add like a couple more here. There we go. Okay, now we're gonna do something similar in the hair. So there's a few areas that just look a little unrefined. So we want to further refine those with the same method that we were just using. So we're gonna have the very small brush. We'll change it between like 1 to 3 pixels and just kind of brush in some hairs here to make sure that this looks like a really nice clean selection. Okay, so I think we've done a pretty good job of getting a nice clean looking hair selection. I've also added some tiny hairs here along the eyebrow to make sure that that looks natural and not kind of just weirdly capped off. So I think that our selection on this is actually looking really good. So let's go ahead and bring our subject into our background image. So we're going to hold Command and click on our mask, and we're going to hit Command C to copy that. And we are going to come over here to our background and hit Command V to paste it. So if we zoom in here, you can see that our subject blends in pretty darn well with the background and looks pretty natural. And I actually already did this whole process on my other subject because we don't really need to go through that twice, right? So let's go ahead and select our other subject and bring that in here. So now we'll zoom out just a tiny bit. And now it's time to position our subjects. Now that we have our subjects in place, we can begin adding our shadows. So because this subject on the right is covering the face of the subject on the left, and their arm is also overlapping the body here, we need to make sure that we add shadows so that this looks like it actually all belongs. So let's actually first go ahead and label these. So I'm just going to put subject right and subject left. And now we're going to actually select our subject on the right hand side by holding Command and clicking on that layer. And then we're going to add a layer beneath that by holding Command again and clicking on the Add New Layer button. And now we're going to fill that layer. So we're going to hit Shift Delete, and we're going to choose a color. So let's choose a color. I'm just going to grab a color from the shadows on my subject here. So something here, and then I want it to be a little bit darker than that. So I'm just gonna drag that down maybe closer to there and click OK and OK. And then we'll hit Command D to deselect that. And then I'm gonna clip this shadow that I just made. We'll just call this like drop shadow because it's gonna be like our first shadow. And we're going to right click on that and choose Create Clipping Mask to clip it to the subject here on the left, because that's what we want the shadow to be cast onto. So I'm gonna go ahead and move my shadow just a little bit out and a little bit down, and I'm going to zoom in here so you can see now we have this shadow underneath the hand and a little bit underneath the arm. So the first thing I want to do is blur that a little bit. So I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and we'll probably do somewhere around 8 or maybe 9. Let's see. I think that looks good, so we'll click OK. So we want it to be a pretty well-defined shadow, because when there's a shadow from something that's just directly underneath that object as it's touching a surface, it's going to be a fairly well-defined shadow. So this should be just about right. Now, one thing that I want to do is I do want to take a little bit of this out over here. So you can just erase with the eraser tool, but because I just always like to be able to go back in the event that I mess something up, I'm going to add a layer mask here. And then I'm going to get my brush. I'm going to make sure that I have my brush in black, which I already do. So if you don't have your default colors here, you can hit D to get those. And then if you hit X, you can toggle back and forth between black and white. So I'm going to use black. I want to make sure my brush is soft, so we can go up here and make sure that we have the hardness at 0. And then I'm just going to paint out this part that's kind of falling on more of the shoulder area, because I don't think that that hard of a shadow would be going over onto the shoulder there, since the arm's probably not directly touching that area. So we're just going to kind of brush that off, and that should be just fine. So the thing with shadows is that you kind of want to build a few layers of shadows that kind of get a little bit bigger as they go. So you're gonna see what I mean by that as we do this here. So this was getting a little bit long and I just wanted to cut it down a bit. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm continuing layering on shadows. So I'm just duplicating the original shadow layer that I created, and then I'm expanding that layer, so using the transform tool to make it a little bit bigger, and then blurring those shadows a little differently, and also changing the opacity on those different layers, so that I'm kind of just stacking shadow on shadow on shadow until I get this more natural appearance to the overall shadows in the image that I'm adding here. And I also painted a little bit of a shadow onto the throat area of the subject. And that's really all that there is to this process. You're just duplicating those layers, playing around with the size of the shadows and the blur and the opacity. And I think we've got our shadows. So what I'll do is I'll just group all of these. So I'm gonna get my subject and all of these shadows. So I'm just clicking on this layer, holding Shift and clicking on the top layer. And then I'm hitting Command G to group them. And we'll call it subject left. Okay, and now that we have our shadows, we can move on to colorizing our subjects. Let's start by colorizing the subject on the right. So I'm going to add a new group here, and I'm going to call it pink. And then I am going to hold Command and click on my subject right layer. And I'm going to add that as a layer mask here by clicking the Add Layer Mask button. So now anything that I put into this group will only apply to the subject on the right. So I'm going to grab a hue adjustment layer. And if you don't have your adjustment layers panel already open, you can find that by going up here to Window and Adjustments. So now we're going to choose Colorize. And that makes it so that it literally just completely colorizes the subject, and you can kind of drag this around whatever color you want. And I'm actually going to leave it right here at 0 because that's already kind of a very light pinkish color. And then I'm going to increase the saturation just a little bit. So I think that's looking pretty good right there. Now let's add a color balance layer. And let's start with the highlights. So I just want it to look about the hue of pink that I'm going for. I want it to kind of blend with the pinks in the background, but it doesn't have to be exactly matching with them either. So this really is just a matter of just kind of messing with these sliders until you get it how you want it to look. Okay, I think I'm liking that right about there. I do think I want to desaturate it just a little bit though, so I'm going to grab another hue saturation layer, and I'm actually going to move that down to the bottom here, and then I'm just going to desaturate it just a little bit. So maybe about 20 is good. Okay, so there we have our pink subject. Now let's do the blue subject. So we're going to get another group. Let's go ahead and select our subject. So we're going to do the subject on the left this time. So we'll hold Command and click on that layer. And then we'll go back up here to our group and we'll hit the Add Layer Mask. And we'll call that blue. And one thing though is that because this subject's hand is covering the other subject's face, I do need to remove that part of the subject off of the other layer mask, right? So let's hold Command and click on this layer mask to select that. and then we're just going to fill it with black. So we'll hit Command Delete to fill that with black. And then you can see here now the hand and the arm from the other subject will not be affected. Okay, so for the blue, we're going to start with the same thing. We're going to add a hue adjustment layer. We're going to colorize that, and we're just going to pull this slider until we get into the blues here. And then we just want to kind of decide what the hue is that we want. So I think this is looking pretty good right about here. I don't think I'm going to change the saturation on that because it already looks pretty saturated here. So let's do a color balance layer. Okay, so I think I'm pretty happy with that. So now we also have our blue subject. So what we need to do is we want some of the blue from this subject bleeding onto the arm of the other subject. So we'll just use our brush on our layer mask here to achieve that. So I'm going to grab my brush. I'm going to make sure that I have white as my foreground color. And it looks like I have my flow set to 50, which is fine. We'll just go ahead and start there. One thing that we want to do is we want to make sure that we're not going outside of either one of these subjects, right? So we'll go ahead and hold Command and select this subject, and then we'll also add this to that mask. So we'll right click here and we'll put Add Mask to Selection, and there we go. Now we have both of our subjects selected, and this will prevent me from having to worry about going outside of the lines as I'm doing this. So now I'm going to paint in white over the hand here, and I want the top to be pretty solid blue, and even down the arm a little bit. But then as I start moving down the arm, I do want this to kind of taper off a little bit. So let's change our flow. So let's hold Shift and hit 2. Let's change it to about 20%. Make my brush just a little bigger. So if you hit the left bracket, that'll make your brush smaller. Right bracket will make it bigger. And we'll just kind of keep painting down the arm here, but now we're going a little more gradually. And we can kind of get into different areas. And I don't want it to be like a perfect sort of transition. We'll kind of just brush some strokes in here towards the bottom. And I think that's looking pretty good. I'm going to paint a little bit with my black brush. I'm gonna lower my flow even more to 10. So I'm gonna hit Shift 1 and just kind of have that sort of transitioning there. And I think that already looks pretty good. So we'll hit Command D to deselect. And now we have our pink and our blue subject, and we have the color kind of bleeding on to our pink subject. So we're getting really far along here in this process. We're pretty close to done. There's just a few finishing touches that we want to put on this. So I wanted to add some birds to the sky, and I knew that I was going to want just silhouetted birds, and I have a stock image of some silhouetted birds. So this will be the one stock image that we're sort of bringing in here. So I'm just going to grab that image really quick. So I'm going over to Bridge, but you can also go up here to File, Open, and then just find the image that you want and open it up. But I usually use Adobe Bridge, so that's just kind of how I work. And then I'm just gonna hit Command A to select everything here, Command C to copy that, and then Command V to paste that into our image. So now we just want to kind of figure out where we want these. So first of all, I don't want them over the top of my subjects. So I'm going to pull this down to underneath pretty much everything. It's only going to be over the background. And then I'm just going to move this around and kind of place it around about where I think I want it. And then I'm going to hit Command J because I'm going to want 2 of these. And I'm going to pull it up, and then I'm going to pull it over. I kind of want it to be about the same distance from the edge on both sides. And now we'll just play a little bit with the blending modes on these layers to give it an interesting look. So for this one on the top, what I usually do is I just kind of scroll through the different blending modes until I come across something that I'm liking. So for this one, we're going to do multiply. And then for this one, we're going to do exclusion. And so now we almost completely have our image. I am going to move my subjects just a tiny bit. So let's select everything except for the background and the birds. And I'm just going to make sure I have my move tool selected by hitting B. And then I'm just going to bump these over just a little bit so they're kind of centered here in this sort of frame that this is creating. And I think that is looking pretty good. So there's one thing that I am noticing that we haven't taken care of yet, and that is that we do need to do some final cleaning up on our subject here to make sure that we don't have any of the dark color from the background we removed our subjects from coming through. So that's called fringing, when you kind of pick up some of that dark color. So let's go into our subject on the left, and we're going to add another layer here, and we're going to clip it. So we'll go right click that and create clipping mask. And then we're going to get our brush, and we'll set the flow to about 30%. And we're just going to brush some blue out into the ends here to make sure that this all looks like it's really all one color. So we'll just kind of select colors from around the edge of the hair and just kind of get in here and make that blend the way that we want it to. Okay, so I think we have this looking pretty good so far. The only things that we really need to do now is just the absolute finishing touches. So typically I'll add a little bit of contrast, so I'll get a curves layer for that. And then the very last thing that I usually do is add a tiny bit of sharpening. And that is it. We are finished with our image. I hope that you have enjoyed this tutorial series. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to leave those in the comments below. And also, if you have any suggestions for anything that you'd like to see me do in the future, I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much, and I will see you all next time.